morning. I would encourage you to open up in your Bibles to Exodus chapter 3. Exodus chapter 3 is where we're going to be in just a couple minutes. You know, the downside of being away from the church building for 2 or 3 months is you kind of lose your routine, and I completely forgot that a microphone is an essential part of our worship service, so I had to run up here real quick and put mine on. Everything seems kind of out of sorts right now, but I like how we're all kind of adjusting. We're all kind of rolling with the punches. It's so good to be with each and every one of you. I said it last week, I mean it even more today. It's so good to be with everybody that's able to make it out. We've got more people here this week, which I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing, but we've got more people here with us this week than we had last week, and so it's always good to see so many smiling faces and a couple frowns coming from this side over here in a blue suit. But it's so good to be with each and every one of you. I've really missed this the last couple months, and I've enjoyed being back with us, just singing together and singing hymns together by itself. Even if we just did that and you didn't listen to me ramble on, I think that would be enough for all of us. I've mentioned several times in the past that I just have this weird fascination with Mount Everest. I don't know what it is. I just am always amazed by it. I love how it's just kind of over there in the middle of nowhere, and it just seems like this just almost impossible obstacle. And the more I read about it, the more I hear about it, the more I randomly find documentaries or whatever it is on Netflix about Everest, the more I'm kind of enthralled by it. But here's something that will surprise absolutely nobody. I will never, ever in a million years climb Mount Everest. And there's a lot of reasons for that. Available lung capacity is one of the biggest ones. I think probably the second one is I'm just probably too lazy to go about the training, the dedication, and the time that it takes. But there's really nothing stopping me from it, aside from my life insurance and my wife stopping me from going over there and doing those types of things. But there's really nothing fundamentally stopping me from it. It's there. The opportunities are available to go over and climb something like that. I just don't really, probably will never take any advantage of it. And as I think about that, I'm okay with that. I'm at peace with that. I'm at understanding with that idea, the fact that I'll never climb it. And then I meet somebody like this guy, Jeffrey Glassbender. I don't actually meet him. I've never met him before in my life. But I read a story about him recently, and if you don't know who Jeffrey Glassbender is, you probably picked up at least a little bit by now by the fact that he doesn't have a right leg. He lost his right leg in a motorcycle accident when he was 17. That has not stopped him from being one of the world's premier Paralympians. He is on Team USA for a whole bunch of different sports, and he's kind of made his living over the last 10, 15 years as being somebody who is a decorated athlete while still maintaining a pretty severe disability. But it would be hard enough for Jeffrey Glassbender to climb up Mount Everest having only one leg, having a prosthetic, but he took it a step further. On his way to Mount Everest, he had a specially designed wheelchair that broke on the way there. They were able to kind of jimmy it together and help him go up to base camp. And then when he was heading up base camp, or heading up from base camp to the top of Mount Everest, his wheelchair finally broke. And he was forced to climb Mount Everest not on 2 legs or 1 leg, but on his hands. He made it all the way up to the top using specially designed gloves that allowed him to walk in a wheelbarrow-esque manner up the side of Mount Everest. This is a person, ladies and gentlemen, that had every reason in the world to stop on at least a number of different occasions, and yet never did. And so as I think back about my own life and the things that I've accomplished in my own world, and think about the fact that I'll never climb that, I keep asking myself, what's my excuse? Once again, going back to my wife and my family and my life insurance policy. But what is my excuse for not doing these types of things? You know, someone once said a long time ago, and I think it's a fantastic illustration, they said excuses are a lot like armpits. Everybody usually has 2, and they both stink. Excuses are those things that are designed to kind of keep us away from an action, something that we are either supposed to be doing or something that we have said that we're supposed to be doing, or responsibility that we may have. But all of us have excuses, and usually they're brought up at very convenient times to get us out of certain circumstances. And people in the Bible are no different. In Exodus, the 3rd chapter, look in Exodus chapter 3 and chapter 4, this is a scene that probably Moses would like to have forgotten in his life. Before Moses goes on to much later things, and he has these amazing stories of leading people in or towards Canaan, not obviously in Canaan, but he talks with God on Mount Sinai, he takes the law, and then he spends 40 years with these people in the wilderness. Before any of that happens, Moses almost allows his excuses to get in the way way of it. In Exodus chapter 3, starting in verse 1, it says, Now Moses was pasturing the flock of Jethro, his father-in-law, the priest of Midian, and he led the flock to the west side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. And the angel of the Lord appeared to him in a blazing fire from the midst of a bush, and he looked, and behold, the bush was burning with fire, yet the bush was not consumed. And Moses said, verse 3, I must turn aside now and see this marvelous sight, why the bush is not burned up. And when the Lord saw that he turned aside to look, God called to him from the midst of the bush and said, Moses, Moses. And he said, Here I am. And he said, Do not come near here. Remove your sandals from your feet, for the place on which you are standing is holy ground. He said also, verse 6, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. And Moses then hid his face, for he was afraid to look at God. Now listen to this conversation that happens between verses 7 through 10, because this is the conversation that is going to change Moses' life. Exodus chapter 3, starting in verse 7, the Lord said, I have surely seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt, and I have given heed to their cry because of their taskmasters, for I am aware of their sufferings. And I have come down to deliver them from the power of the Egyptians, and to bring them up from that land to a good and spacious land, to a land flowing with milk and honey, to the place of the Canaanite, and the Hittite, and the Amorite, and the Perizzite, and the Hivite, and the Jebusite. Now behold, verse 9, the cry of the sons of Israel has come to me. And furthermore, I have seen the oppression with which the Egyptians are oppressing them. Therefore come now, I will send you to Pharaoh, so that you may bring my people, the sons of Israel, out of Egypt. 4 verses, ladies and gentlemen, that define Moses' life moving forward. And I would imagine if Moses could go back in time and think about this exact moment when he encounters God on the mountain, he probably at various points in his life wished that he could go back and avoid that mountain because of what's eventually going to happen with the complaining and the whining and all the tribulations that he's going to endure over those next 40 years of his life. They're going to be very intense. But in 4 verses, God gives him his mission for the rest of his life, which sounds very simple on paper. I want you to go to Egypt. I want you to free my people from the grips of the most powerful monarch in the earth at that time. And I want you to bring them to a land that is inhabited by 7 different peoples, every one of them, which is stronger than your people. Simple. And all of us look at Exodus chapters 3 and 4, this little situation where Moses then has excuse after excuse after excuse, and we think, I can't believe that you're whining about this. Why not just do God's will and move on? And then we think about what he was asked to do and realize just how severe a task that was. But when you look at these excuses that Moses had in Exodus chapters 3 and 4, there are appeals to a whole bunch of different things. For instance, in chapter 3 and verse 11, we'll step through these piece by piece here in a second, but in verse 11, he appeals to the authority. He says, I don't have the authority to go and command something like this of Pharaoh. In verse 13, he appeals to recognition. We'll talk about that a little bit more here in a second. Chapter 4 and verse 1, he appeals to doubt. What if they don't know who you are? What if they don't know who I am? What if none of this ends up working at all? Chapter 4 and verse 10, he appeals to talents. He says, I'm not nearly skilled enough. I don't have the vocabulary. I am not eloquent enough. This is something that I obviously have no problem with as I stumble word after word after word. But he appeals to talent. I don't have the ability to go do something like that. And finally, verse 13, he appeals to desire. And ladies and gentlemen, out of the 5 excuses that he has, verse 13 of chapter 4 is the only one that really counts, because the other 4 just deflect. The other 4 are just excuses. Those are just blatant excuses to try and get him to not do what God is directly asking him to do. And you read those, and we have the benefit of matching them up with his life, and we think to ourselves, why did you even care about that? Why did you care about the fact that people might not have believed who sent you when you have the plagues? But Moses didn't know that at that point. But to us, 2,000, 3,000 years later, we just groan about it. There's something about us as human beings that when we know somebody else is making an excuse, we hate it. Let me ask you a question. How many people in the last month have heard an excuse from somebody else that just made you groan? Coralie is the only honest person in this building. I see slowly hands. Everybody's making excuses for why they didn't hear the excuse. Let me ask you another question. How many people in this building have made an excuse in the last month that looking back on, you groaned thinking about? All of us make excuses. All of us have heard excuses. Thank you, John. I was a little late on that one. All of us have heard excuses. And all of us make excuses. And all excuses do, according to what you read about here and what we read about in our own life, all they do is deflect away from the thing that we're supposed to be doing. And as great as Moses was There's no difference. And so what I want to do with the lesson this morning, that was my introduction, if you can believe that. What I want to do this morning is I want to step really quickly through each one of the excuses, because I don't think when Moses says these different things that that's really what he's getting at. Moses says something, but what he means is totally different. For instance, I want you to look at verse 10 and 11. He says here in Exodus chapter 3 and verse 11, Moses says, "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh, that I should bring the sons of Israel out of Egypt?" That's what he says. What Moses actually means is, what gives me the right to demand something of Pharaoh? Now, before we recoil in shock that he is equating Jehovah on any plane with somebody like Pharaoh and trying to equate those two people, think about what this means for a second. Moses is at best, or is at the very least, a fugitive of the law, having killed an Egyptian 40 years earlier, and now God is asking him not just to go back and take up residence there in Egypt. He's asking Moses to go back and ask the leader of the entire world at that point. Egypt is the dominant power in the world at this point. He is asking Pharaoh to give up his 2.5 million person labor force for free to go worship a God who Pharaoh thinks he is. That's a tall order. And so Moses, to say this here in chapter 3 and verse 11, he's not saying this in the sense of, what if this doesn't work? What if this? He says, who gives me the right? But if you look back at Exodus chapter 3, starting in verse 7, look at what he says right here. Exodus chapter 3, starting in verse 7. Read this section again, because I want you to notice the pronouns that are being used. Exodus chapter 3, starting in verse 7. The Lord said, I've surely seen the affliction of my people who are in Egypt, and I've given heed to their cry because of their taskmasters, for I am aware of their sufferings. So I have come down to deliver them from the power of the Egyptians, and to bring them up from that land to a good and spacious land, to a land flowing with milk and honey, to the Canaanite, the Hittite, the Amorite, the Perizzite, the Hivite, the Jebusite. Now, verse 9, behold, the cry of the sons of Israel has come to me. Furthermore, I have seen the oppression with which the Egyptians are oppressing them. Therefore come now, and I will send you to Pharaoh, so that you may bring my people, the sons of Israel, out of Egypt. Let me ask you real quick. What's the focus of Exodus chapter 3, verses 7 through 10? At no point, or at very few points here in Exodus chapter 3, verses 7 through 10, do you ever at any point mention or see God mentioning Moses. He says, I want you to do this, but the focal point, the primary character in Exodus chapter 3, verses 7 through 10 is not Moses. The primary character is God. And sometimes we forget that, and Moses certainly did. As Moses is approaching Egypt and he's thinking about this task in his head, more or less he's almost surely thinking of the fact, all the things that he has to do moving forward. But what God tells him in Exodus chapter 3, verses 7 through 10, is that it's not you just walking up willy-nilly, it is me. And ladies and gentlemen, sometimes we have a hard time with that in our own life. Sometimes when we make excuses about why we don't evangelize, or why we make excuses about why we don't talk to somebody about their sin, we always ask the same question that Moses did. What gives me the right to do something like that? And when we say that, we forget that it's not really us. When we talk to somebody about the gospel, what we're not saying is you need to be converted to the gospel of Brady, which is the worst gospel ever, by the way. We're not saying that I think your life is in sin and you might need to make some changes. That's not what's important here. What's important here is God says about your life and about my life that we need to get it in concert with the Bible. That's what's important. And we forget that, ladies and gentlemen. We put undue stress upon our own relationship and our own responsibility within the kingdom by making it about ourselves instead of about the one person who truly matters, which is God. I want you to look in Acts the 3rd chapter. Keep your finger in Exodus 3, but look over at Acts the 3rd chapter. Acts chapter 3, if you would. Acts chapter 3, starting in verse 1. Acts. That's a new one on me. If you find that book, let me know. I'd love to read it. Look at Acts chapter 3, starting in verse 1. Acts chapter 3, starting in verse 1. Now Peter and John were going up to the temple at the 9th hour, the hour of prayer. And a man who had been lame from his mother's womb was being carried along, whom they used to set down every day at the gate of the temple, which is called Beautiful, in order to beg alms of those who were entering the temple. And when he saw Peter and John about to go into the temple, he began asking to receive alms. But Peter, along with John, fixed his gaze on him and said, Look at us. And And he began to give them his attention, expecting to receive something from them. But Peter said, I do not possess silver and gold, but what I do have I give to you. In the name of Jesus Christ the Nazarene, walk. Now, Peter is a minor celebrity at this point. Peter and John are both minor celebrities at this point. And this person who is infirmed and looking at them could have very easily looked at them as being the source of power. But notice how in verse 6, Peter points the direction towards God. If you jump down to verse 12, this is a theme he's going to continue. In verse 12, when Peter saw this, talking about the commotion that's arousing as a part of this, when Peter saw this, he replied to the people, Men of Israel, why are you amazed at this? Why do you gaze at us as if by our own power or piety we had made him walk? The God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the God of our fathers, he's glorified his servant Jesus, the one on whom you delivered and disowned in the presence of Pilate when he decided to release him. But you disowned the holy and righteous one and asked for a murderer to be granted to you, but put to death the Prince of Life, the one whom God raised from the dead, a fact to which we are witnesses. Peter and John not for 1 second point the power towards themselves, but exclusively point it towards God. That's a lesson for us, ladies and gentlemen. When we look at the expectations that are placed upon us as Christians about going and helping other people get free from their sin, or spreading the gospel towards other people, or any of the other 1,000 occupations that we're tasked with, the most important point is to start with the fact that it's not about us. It's about God. It's always been about God, and it will always be about God. Look at this excuse in verse 13. And notice, by the way, that God really only gives him one verse in response to that. Don't worry about that. Let's move on to something else. Moses brings up another excuse in verse 13. He says, Behold, I'm going to the sons of Israel, and I shall say to them, the God of your fathers has sent me to you. Now they may say to me, what is his name? What shall I say to them? Now verse 13 is what Moses actually said. What did he mean? What he meant was, what if they don't know who you are? I think that's a very honest question. You have to keep in mind about how much time has elapsed between the end of Exodus, or the end of Genesis and the beginning of Exodus. You're looking at a period of 400 plus years. And the tales of God are mostly oral traditions that are handed down from person to person to person. And so the idea of Jehovah is not especially prominent in the mind of the Hebrews at this point. And so what he says here in verses 13 down through basically the end of this chapter is he says, you go and talk to them, bring the elders, remind them, they'll know who I am. But Moses has this idea in his mindset that he's going and bringing some kind of foreign God, some kind of foreign understanding. And what Moses needs to understand is that nothing he is going to bring to them is rocket science. He's talking to them about the God of their ancestors, the God of creation, the God of power. But nothing that he's bringing to them is earth-shattering. And sometimes we have this idea in our minds when we go and talk to people about the gospel that we need to be the smartest person in the room. We need to be able to answer every single thing and every question that somebody has about God. We need to rattle off all the answers. You can ask Sandra, by the way, how good I am at answering every single question that somebody would have. I am actually very abysmal at it. But we sometimes feel like we need to come to somebody with all the answers to all their questions. Somebody asks me about the Trinity, I need to have this 3-part answer. Somebody asks me about baptism, I need to have all the verses memorized right off the bat. God never demands us of that. And when we go to people and talk to them, we have this same idea. What shall I say to them? What about the authority of God? What about the authority of the church? What about the authority of the Bible? I need to have all these answers in my mind. And God very simply boils it down for them. I want you to go. I want you to explain to the elders, and then I want you to go to Pharaoh. It's not rocket science. Go and tell them that God demands that you let my people go. I love how Solomon at the end of Ecclesiastes boils down the essence of every spiritual and obedient work that has ever been known to man. He boils it down in Ecclesiastes chapter 12, verses 13 through 14, when he says the base of everything is to fear God and keep his commandments. Obedience to God is not rocket science. It's hard for us sometimes to convince others, and especially convince ourselves, that we need to be following God, but it's not rocket science. And so when Moses has this question right here at the outset, what shall I say to them? God very simply breaks it down through verses 14 through the end of the chapter. This is what you're going to say. But then chapter 4 verse 1 opens up. And Moses answers and says, what will they say? What if they will not believe me or listen to what I say? For they may say, the Lord has not appeared to you. This is that appeal to authority that we talked about a second ago. Where Moses walks up to God or walks up to these people and he says, God says, let my people go. What if they question my credibility? What he's actually asking here is, what if they don't believe me? And I think that comes at a very honest place. All of us, once again, fall into this same trap because I don't have a PhD, or because I don't have years of experience, or because I'm not a high-ranking member in the church. I'm not an elder. And we can't all be Cody Crumptons, as much as us try, as much as we try in our life. But I can't be this person. I don't have any real pedigree behind me. So what puts me in a position to tell somebody else? Or let's boil it down a little further. Let's say that I want to go tell somebody about the gospel, but they know my past. And they know my history. They know where I came from. What gives me the right to go up to somebody else and tell them about what they need to do to be saved? That's what Moses was asking. What if they don't believe me? And once again, the answer goes back to this phrase. It's not about us. It's about God. And describing the idea of spiritual gifts in 1 Corinthians chapter 14, verse 22, Paul makes the emphatic statement that signs or tongues are for a sign not to those who believe, but to unbelievers. What Paul understood in the early church was he understood that people were going and spreading the gospel to various people, and that there were going to be a lot of people when they heard about the resurrection of the dead, specifically from the Gentile world. But he knew there were going to be a lot of people, especially when they heard about the resurrection from the dead, that would question what you're saying. And so tongues, miracles, gifts of healing, these types of things were given to emphasize the authority from where that came from. And when we go talk to people, we need to realize we have the same authority backing us up as well. If you look at the last couple chapters of the book of John, in John chapter 20, John makes this statement, which, by the way, if you haven't thought about using John as bulletproof, and I say that as much as something can be bulletproof, especially when we talk about the gospel, which is bulletproof, I think John is that. I think the Gospel of John is one of the best evangelistic tools that we can think of. But in John chapter 20, after all of these conversations, and John is, as we've mentioned several times, markedly different than the other Gospels. But in John chapter 20, starting in verse 30, it says, "Therefore many other signs Jesus also performed in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in this book. But these have been written so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that believing you may have life in his name." I would encourage you, if you're struggling with somebody, if you're talking to somebody who is struggling with faith, I would encourage you to read the Gospel of John with them. Certainly read Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Those are fantastic Gospels. But John is a distinctly personal Gospel. And when you see the way that Jesus interacts with humans, it does something that touches us on a much more personal level, because Jesus, in John, more than any other Gospel, gets down to our level. The Gospel of John is a fantastic evangelistic tool, and the way that John closes his book out is talking about the myriad of other signs that he did in verses 30 and 31, and then doubles down on it in chapter 21 by saying in verse 24, "This is the disciple who is testifying to these things and wrote these things, and we know that his testimony is true. And there are also many other things which Jesus did." Listen to this in verse 25. "There are also many other things which Jesus did, which if they were written about in detail, I suppose that even the world itself could not contain the books that would be written." The Gospels have an extraordinary amount of detail for us. And the things that are in the Gospels are given to us for our specific understanding, and especially for our teaching other people. But you know as well as I do, there are going to be people that walk up and say, "Well, I don't believe in this. I don't believe that. I don't believe that. I don't believe that." If God calls down thunder from heaven right now, will that be enough for you? And for some people, that simply won't be. I'm always mindful of the parable of the rich man and Lazarus. When the rich man is in torment and he's sitting there in flames, and he looks up at Abraham, he looks up at Lazarus, and he begs Abraham, "Send Lazarus." I don't know why he picks out Lazarus specifically, but he says, "Send Lazarus to my brothers." Do you remember why? He says, "For I have 5 brothers, and they will listen to Lazarus." Abraham says, "I'm not going to do that. They have Moses and the prophets." And the rich man begs with him. He says, "If you send somebody from the grave, they will believe." And Abraham responds with, "Even if I send 1,000 people," which obviously I'm paraphrasing, "but even if I send him from the grave, your brothers are not going to believe if they don't believe Moses and the prophets. Show us a miracle and it's enough for us," the crowd told Jesus. And Jesus said, "A wicked and adulterous generation seeks after a sign, not for the fact that signs in themselves are evil, but there are some people, no matter what they see, no matter what they experience, no matter what they hear, no matter what they understand, they will never truly obey the gospel." It's not because they don't want to, or not because they can't. It's because they don't want to. And when Moses brings up this excuse in verse 1, he's peddling to that minority or to that group of people who will look at the plagues and look at all the things that Moses would do, which Moses, by the way, shows up with Pharaoh in his first encounter and starts doing miracles. But there are going to be people who look at that and say, well, God didn't show this to you. God hasn't appeared to you. What if they don't believe in me? God wants them to know that the miracles and the signs that are accompanying him, those are going to be his ammo with which to preach the gospel. Of course, Moses isn't done with his excuses, because in chapter 4 and verse 10, he says, please, Lord, I have never been eloquent, neither recently nor in time past, nor since thou hast spoken to thy servant, for I am slow of speech and I am slow of tongue. You know what he actually meant by this, don't you? What he actually meant was, I'm just not good enough. I don't think I'm talented enough. I don't think I have the skills. I don't think I have the expertise. I don't think I have the ability to go in and convince Pharaoh to release 2.5 million people into the wilderness. I don't have that ability. To that I will respond, who does? Who does have the ability? I always think to myself when I think about my own life and how I'm not, by any stretch of the imagination, what was said in sarcasm earlier, I'll say it in 100% honesty, I am not the most eloquent speaker. I talk way too fast. I sometimes make up words on the spot. And I think to myself, if I could only be just a little bit better than maybe person in pew X, which there's no pew X over here, but maybe if I was just a little bit better, person in pew X over here would finally understand the gospel, finally come to a saving grace, saving obedience rather. And then I realized that Jesus was the greatest teacher, the great physician, the great shepherd. And at his crucifixion, everybody left him. And after feeding 5,000 people on the hills of Judea, everybody left him when things started to get tough. What I've had to realize, and what hopefully all of us have realized, and I think all of us have realized this to a certain extent, is that oftentimes it doesn't matter about the way you present the gospel. It doesn't matter that you have the most amazing speech and the most amazing vocabulary. There are some people that won't listen to you. And Moses allows that here in verse 10 to cripple him by saying, if you only sent somebody else, if you only looked at somebody else, by the way, Aaron over here, that's what God talks about, but Aaron over here, he's much better than me. Now, how much success did Aaron have? It still took 1.5 years and a number of plagues to get the people out of Egypt. And yet God allowed Aaron to speak for Moses. But Moses pleads to his talent, or in his self-perceived lack of talent, as an excuse for his lack of action. The day of judgment, God won't care about what talent we have. God won't care about all the things that we could have done had we just had an extra 5%. Had we just had a little bit more time, had a little bit more ability, had a little bit more resources, had a little bit more understanding. God won't care about that. God will look in the same way that the parable of the talents illustrate. He'll look at the 5, the 3, the 1 talent man, and he'll ask us, did you do the most you could with what you had? And for some people, what looks like everything they have to other people may look like not much, or vice versa. But the only thing that matters is, are we making the most of what we have? Are we using the talent that God has given to us? It should come as a source of great comfort for us that when we go and talk to people about the gospel, we're not really trying to get them to bend their arm and force them into the waters of baptism. That's not really our job. I guarantee you right now, I could get 10,000 baptisms today. All I would need is $500 for every single person in Greenville to come down, or a third of people in Greenville to come down to the baptistry. I could get that many people today. But that doesn't equal faith. That doesn't equal obedience. That doesn't equal knowledge. That doesn't equal commitment. We need to be approaching people with a sincere heart and a humble heart to simply communicate the gospel to them and allow the word to spread. As Paul very humbly said, I planted, Apollos watered, but it was God who gave the increase. That should be our focus, and it should be a source of great comfort for us. Finally, at the very end, Moses gets to the root of the matter when he says, I just don't really want to. I don't really want to go. And who could blame him? Moses is living a pretty good life in the house of his father-in-law, Jethro in Midian, away from the throes of Egypt, away from his past. He's led a pretty good life. And so who wants to disrupt something like that to then go over to Egypt and do something that will probably, most likely, cost you your life, at least if you're looking at it from a purely physical standpoint? What he said was, please send the message by whomever thou wilt. Ironically, that implies that God wants him to go do it. But he says, I just really don't want to do it. And I think when it comes to the core of our inaction in the kingdom, whether you're talking about public service, private service, whether you're talking about personal evangelism, whether you're talking about public evangelism, whether you're talking about ridding yourself of temptation or helping others rid themselves of the temptation, it always boils down to, I just don't want to do it. But those 4 buffer excuses clouded the vision of Moses and said, what about this, what about this, what about this, what about this? And God blows right through those to get to the heart of the matter. I want you to look in John the 5th chapter. I think it's telling, by the way, that as soon as Moses says this, as soon as Moses says, I just really don't want to do it, as soon as he says that, I think, if memory serves me right, for the first time in these 2 chapters, it says explicitly that the anger of the Lord burned against Moses. As it should be. Because whenever God tells us to do something in our excuses, I just really don't want to do it. What other recourse does he have? What other recourse do we have? In John the 5th chapter, starting in verse 33, he says, you have sent to John, and he has testified of the truth. But the testimony which I receive is not from man, but I say these things so that you may be saved. He was the lamp that was burning and was shining, and you were willing to rejoice for a while in his light. There's one testimony. There's one proof. Verse 36, but the testimony which I have is greater than the testimony of John, for the works which the Father has given me to accomplish, the very works that I do, testify about me that the Father has sent me. Testimony of the works. Testimony of John, testimony of the works. Verse 37, the Father who sent me, he has testified of me. You have neither heard his voice at any time, nor have you ever seen his form. You don't have his word abiding in you, for you do not believe him whom he sent. Third testimony. Testimony of John, testimony of the works, testimony of the Father. Look in verse 39. You search the Scriptures because you think in them you have eternal life, and yet it is these that testify about me. Fourth testimony. John, works, Father, and Scripture. 4 proofs about who God is. Listen to verse 40. You are unwilling to come to me so that you may have life. I don't know if it's providence or if it's just a fancy preacher thing to happen at this exact point in time, but you have 4 excuses of Moses until you get to the right answer, which is that he just didn't want to do it. And you have 4 testimonies here in John the 5th chapter before you get to the heart of the matter, which is in verse 40, which is that they were just unwilling to come to him. That's really what it's all about. When people confront us, and when we make excuses, now I don't want to do this because of that, or I don't feel like I'm good enough to stand in public, or I don't feel like I'm good enough to go to this person and talk to them about their sins, I don't feel like I'm good enough. Almost always it boils down to the simple task, or a simple reality, that I just don't want to do it. And I don't know how you approach that. I don't know how you come back from that. I don't know how you come back from that in dealing with other people, and I certainly don't know how you come back from that in my own personal life. When I'm faced with the reality that my failure to act and failure to serve in the kingdom is a result of my simple lack of desire, what's the solution for that? Ironically, it's the same solution that we talked about earlier with Mount Everest. There's no reason I can't climb Mount Everest. Once again, my wife would kill me if I got back. If Everest doesn't, she would. I just don't want to. I don't have any real desire to do it. But people who don't allow excuses to stop them, people who don't allow their self-perceived limitations to stop them in their kingdom of God, those are always the people who do the most good. And I'm constantly amazed by people that I see in the kingdom who have stayed for a long period of time in this world. And they've maybe existed in a box, or maybe I thought they couldn't do this or do that. And then something happens, and they go on a rampage. And they blow me away. Every single person that I've ever heard that comes up here and does an invitation, usually at some point in their life has said, I can't do it because of blank. And then they come up here and do an invitation, and I am always encouraged and walk away better off as a Christian as a result. And I guarantee you every single person in this building feels the same way. So if you're sitting here this morning and you've made excuses for your own life, whether you've made excuses for inaction, I just can't do public worship because of this or that, or I can't go talk to this person because of this or that, or I can't get free from this temptation because of this or that, recognize first and foremost that if it's disobedience, that's an excuse that's keeping you from it, nothing more. And recognize, number 2, that it's our lack of desire that most oftentimes get in the way. Not a lack of opportunity, not a lack of evidence, not a lack of authority, but but it's a lack of desire. God has called all of us to work in His kingdom in various capacities, in various ways, and doing different things. And anything that stops us from that is at best an excuse, and at worst laziness. And before I talk to anybody else, I need to first and foremost talk to myself when I say that. We all need to be working in the kingdom. We all need to be pushing forward and not allowing our self-perceived limitations to stop us. And so if you've made excuses for why you aren't a Christian, blow those out of the way right now and come forward as we stand and as we sing.